and Risk Through Technology, or Native Chart, and Native Center for Alcohol Research and Education, or NCARE, webinar series. My name is Adam Livengood. I'm a research program manager at the Partnerships for Native Health program at the Institute for Research and Education to Advance Community Health, also known as iReach. Next slide. I quickly want to go over the Zoom features for today. So on the bottom of your screens, you should see a chat option, which you can use to then send messages to all participants, or you can send a message directly to the hosts. There's also a raise your hand feature. However, we ask that you please hold your questions until the end, as there's going to be a designated Q&A time. So please do so by typing your questions into the Q&A box on the bottom right. All right, next slide. So for today's webinar, Drs. Gary Ferguson and Amanda Boyd will be providing a brief overview of iReach, as well as the Native Chart and Native and NCARE research centers. And then Cole Allick will give his presentation on working with tribal nations and people, and we'll then end with a 10-minute Q&A session. After the conclusion of this webinar, you'll be given a chance to provide some feedback through an evaluation survey. And a recording of the webinar is also going to be made available on both the Native Chart and NCARE websites, which can be accessed through our main website page on ireach.wsu.edu. And we'll also send an email with the link as soon as it's posted. All right, next slide. So now I'd like to welcome Dr. Gary Ferguson.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Gary Ferguson. I serve as the Director of Outreach and Engagement here at iReach, and I'm really excited to hear Cole Allick speak today. A little bit about iReach. We're at Washington State University. We challenge the status quo and advance community health through partnerships and collaboration. We conduct research with rural, Native, and Latinx populations, health networks, and populations with substance use disorders. Next slide, please. Our iReach faculty belong to various colleges at Washington State University, and we partner with external collaborators at universities across the country. The Institute houses 5 primary research programs, including Partnerships for Native Health. Next slide, please. Partnerships for Native Health conducts community-based research and education to improve health and reduce health disparities among American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. We do this by working with both community and academic partners in community settings. We focus on achieving health equity, community outreach, and engagement in training and education. We have over 60 partners across the country, including tribal colleges, Native organizations, tribes, universities, and satellite centers. Northwest Health Education and Research Outcomes Network aims to improve the quality of clinical care and ameliorate health disparities in communities across Washington and surrounding areas. And our Latinx Health is advancing Latinx health through the formation of community partnerships and focusing on academic research. I will now let Dr. Amanda Boyd share information on the Native Chart and NCARE, which are centers within our Partnerships for Native Health core. Next slide, Amanda.
Tansi, hello, and thank you, Gary, for that introduction. And thank you all for joining us for this webinar on working with tribal nations and people. My name is Amanda Boyd. I am Métis and Daneza from the Treaty 8 territory in Canada. I'm also an associate professor in the Edward R. Murrow College of Communication. And I have the pleasure of co-leading the Native Chart and the NCARE dissemination course with Dr. Gary Ferguson. And I have the pleasure of introducing these 2 NIH-funded research centers that are co-hosting this presentation. So within Native Chart, our aim is to improve control of blood pressure and other risk factors for cardiovascular disease in American Indian, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander populations who are diagnosed with hypertension. The center is comprised of 3 community-based intervention projects and 4 supporting cores. So next slide, please. The NCARE Center aims to optimize alcohol intervention research for public health in general and our Native community partners in particular. So we accomplish this goal by collaboratively engaging with research project teams and the pilot projects to conduct research that yields high quality data while simultaneously meeting the unique needs of our partners. Next slide, please. And so we work with 7 satellite centers located in Alaska, Colorado, Minnesota, New Mexico, North Carolina, Oklahoma, and Washington. The work we do with these centers ensures that our research topics are important to American Indian and Alaska Native populations throughout the US, and outreach and dissemination efforts are amplified throughout the country. Next slide. And now I would like to turn this over to our presenter, Cole Allick. Thank you.
Miigwech, thank you everybody for the introductions this morning and getting us set up. Bonjour, Gigijeb, hello, good morning. It's still morning in Seattle, so I can say that. So it might not be elsewhere. I'll be giving a presentation today. I'm super excited. Next slide, please. The reason I'm excited is because it's Native American Heritage Month, and so this presentation feels super timely as we enter into the holiday season. I think it's a great opportunity to just share in conversation and dialogue and sort of take a deep dive. Next slide, please. So I wanted to formally introduce myself. I'm a citizen of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians in North Dakota, where I was born and raised and where my family still resides. I think it's really important to share really deeply where I'm from and what I'm bringing to our conversation this morning, because in my culture and in many Indigenous cultures, data is a collection of our stories, our voice, and working in this environment is very personal in nature. I recognize that I am simply just one Native voice in a sea of many, and so today I'm hoping to share with you my experiences, my perspectives, and the shared knowledge I have from my experiences working across Indian country, as well as non-Native institutions. But I'm as much of a guest on this land as many of you are. Today I'm calling in from the unceded Duwamish territory here in Seattle. And so I wanted to provide that land acknowledgement and also recognize too, and I think this could be a separate presentation in itself, is the era of land acknowledgements when we're all joining via Zoom. And so I will just make sort of a general statement that wherever you're calling from, just wanting to honor those who came before us and were stewards of that land previously, and just wanted to start the day in this presentation with that honoring. Next slide, please. So the other piece too, to kind of set the background for this presentation, so folks joining today aren't confused with different language used, but there are some key terms that I just want to call out as I will use them throughout this presentation. The first is tribal nations, which refer to those tribal entities, which can be called tribes, nations, bands, pueblos, communities, and Native villages that have that formal nation-to-nation relationship with the US government. And I'll dive a little bit deeper into that later. You'll also hear American Indian and Alaska Native, which is sometimes abbreviated as AIAN, which are those persons belonging to the indigenous tribes of the continental US, American Indians, and the indigenous tribes and villages of Alaska, referred to as Alaska Natives. You'll also hear maybe Native American, and then generally as we talk about kind of the environment of all of us Native people and organizations working together, that's commonly referred to as Indian country. And we'll also take a deep dive today into this word sovereignty, which is a legal word for an ordinary concept, which is to just self-govern. And you may hear me in particular kind of go in between using indigenous and native, for example. And so sometimes they are used interchangeably, but one thing I want to say is that it's ultimately up to the community that you're working with, how best to refer to them. And so next slide, please. So today's agendas and goals, as I mentioned, I want to introduce a framework that guides my work. Really important to really shift the way that we think about Indian country generally, including its members and the visibility of Native peoples today in a 21st century world. What many people know or that they think they know is so rooted in many half-truths and is too often solely deficit-based, which means that it focuses on challenges and weaknesses, whether they're real, assumed, or exaggerated, rather than really being focused on some of the strengths and opportunities working in Indian country. It really doesn't take into account that Native people have been scientists, astrologists, policymakers, healers, since the beginning of creation, and that have solutions to our collective shared problems that we face as a society today. Well-meaning allies and sometimes even organizations serving Native populations often unintentionally spread this false narrative by focusing on deficits and not really leaving room to talk about assets, which, is part of the way some of the work is funded, right? So when we're looking at funding opportunities and policies and programs, we do have to talk about need, right? And that's important. And I think the beauty of a strengths-based approach is that it allows for us to talk about the realities and the challenges that we faced while making room for conversations around strength and resiliency. And then really specifically wanted to do kind of an overview embedded within this framework on tribal sovereignty, a small dive into Indigenous research methods and topics. Since we are a research institution, it feels very appropriate to have that conversation. And excitingly talk about the 2020 census and some of its highlights as well. So next slide, please. So today I want to introduce the framework, like I said, that guides my work. It comes out of the Reclaiming Native Truth project, which is a project that was intended to dispel the dominant narrative of these, misconceptions and beliefs that the general society has about Native people. And I'm not going to dive into many of the kind of stereotypical things you might hear, because we could be here and having a completely different conversation. But it is important to just call it that was the intent of that work. It was launched about 5 years ago and was a national effort with Indigenous community members and stakeholders with over 180 contributors. Some of the really key players were like National Congress of American Indians was a huge contributor, as well as local leaders here in the Seattle area, and really just had a lot of vested people in coming up with this framework. And so what they did is they engaged over 20,000 people in one of the largest public opinion research projects, especially in the realm of this work in Indian country. And they analyzed over 5 million blog posts, social media posts, to sort of put data behind what a lot of Native people, myself included, have experienced moving through different institutions, whether it's the academy, in social settings, in school where we don't learn the complete history. And like I said, actually put data to some of this experience that we all face. And so next slide. The framework itself, as I mentioned, is sort of a best practice framework that sort of begins any work that I conduct or enter into, not only with work, but also just kind of with my approach as well. Oh, shoot, you know what? I forgot to introduce another key part about me. I am a current PhD student in the Indigenous Health PhD program at the University of North Dakota. So while I work full-time at iReach and do all this work, I'm also halfway through my program, and I'm part of the first cohort that's largely comprised of other Indigenous students. And so I'm also bringing that kind of positionality into this presentation today. And I think I have a few classmates and maybe even some professors on. And so I apologize for not giving that important piece of information, but I'm doing so now. So now you guys have the full context. But this work really, informs a lot of my approaches to not only school, but also work here at iReach. Even in my personal life too, just with connecting with people. It's something that I find that I really enjoy, is connecting and conversing. You probably can hear that I talk really fast because I get really excited. But yeah, this work stems from that public opinion research initiative that was conducted. And what it really does is just gives us, some structure to any work that we do, right? So it starts with a problem, an issue, or an opportunity. And then the core components of values, history, and visibility are included to kind of give us that connection piece. And what I really, really appreciate about this framework is that it ends with a call to action. I think too often I leave a lot of meetings being like, so what are we going to do about it? Like, we just spent all this time talking, like, what are we tangibly going to do to start this work? And so again, I'm going to go into each of the core components here and give you a little taste of what they actually, what they encapsulate, and then structure the rest of the presentation within this framework. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll talk about the first two pieces, which are values and history. And so values, again, goes back to that piece on connection. And so often I find myself working in community or with non-native allies and partners, and I just start asking people things that we might share in common, right? So like I might ask, how many people grew up in rural communities, right? I grew up in a small town that had like 300 people. I think we had more people in the town when school was in session than we actually had living in town. I can ask about how many people value their family. Let's talk about traditions around the holiday, right? Holiday season's coming up. Maybe we all do something super similar. But bringing us to the present really prevents that shift to those romanticized and false ideas of what Native culture actually is, and brings that human connection to our conversations. The next piece, which I think is really important, is history. Research does show that most non-Native people don't fully understand the history of tribal nations, but they're open to learning and often feel frustrated when what they're taught is either false or incomplete. And frustration is okay, right? Like, we only have 45 minutes today to go through years of knowledge and things that we think we know, right? So to just dismantle that in 45 minutes and have people leave here feeling like they've gotten the perfect history lesson, that's just not realistic. And there are going to be frustrations on both ends. And I think it's just important to say that that's okay. But hearing Native voices with an open heart and mind, a mind that allows our perceptions to be challenged, can be really fruitful in creating a genuinely receptive experience in having these conversations, right? It lets our partners be super curious, hear more from community, and be willing to act on issues relevant to Indian country. I will preface and say too, that it's not necessarily the job of brown, Black, Native people to be just teaching you. You need to come and provide that effort as well. But I think challenging this history is really, really important as we move forward. Next slide, please. So the last two pieces of the framework that I wanted to break out specifically are also visibility. And so when we think about history, we also have to think about the present, right? So I always hear this, people saying, oh, I've never met a Native person. I've never met a Native person. And it's like, well, actually, you probably have. You probably just didn't think we looked, or we didn't match your impression of what you thought we'd look like. And it's important to call it that we are here. We're among various organizations and professions across Indian country and the US, in both Native and non-Native institutions. Some of us may be the first in our various roles, right? Like Secretary Holland, for example. That's a very prominent first person in that role specifically. But in a lot of cases, we're part of a young, educated, culturally driven workforce, and we carry our Indigenous identities and ways of knowing and being into. And then again, that final piece, like I said, is a really strong call to action. And so being really specific about how all of us, when we join these conversations, can leave knowing that there's something for us to do to contribute to that specific opportunity. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to do sort of a deep dive, again, framing it within those core values. So values, history, and visibility, just so we get a sense of how to use this framework and kind of spur conversation. So next slide. So the first thing, as I said, we get into is values. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide just because it's not as, we don't have as many opportunities to sort of engage participant to participant today. Next slide. But what I would normally do, like I said, is just sort of ask like what unites us, right? And that's going to have different contexts depending on what the reason is for gathering as partners and allies, what the project is, or what we're trying to work on. But the reality is just getting us to the same page. One specific example from research that sticks out for me is talking a lot about gift cards and honoring people for their time. And so I usually ask folks, like, how many of us would want our time respected if we're asked to participate in an interview or a survey, right? And then I start asking people, like, well, what does that look like? What does your time look like? And if someone asks for it, what would you expect? And then we've had conversations even around like jury duty, right? You don't get that much for jury duty, but even that, they expect some sort of compensation. For my culture in particular, when you come and ask for guidance or wisdom, especially from an elder, you give an offering of respect, just to honor that person for what you're asking and receiving from them. And so that's something that I think as an institution, when I come in, that's what I'm expecting. And that's how I would do any sort of research as a PI. And sometimes we find ourselves having, bureaucratic hurdles where, if you're asking someone for a full day session and they're like, yeah, you can give them a $10 gift card. Does that really seem like it's fair for asking, a Native elder or any Native participant, or really any participant, to spend a whole day there, especially if they have to take like 8 bus routes and drive through traffic in Seattle, where we currently are. And so these are sort of probing questions to get people thinking and asking those important facets of any sort of research project. Next slide, please. So where I really want to spend some time today is giving some background and history on just Native people generally, like I said, sovereignty, and a little bit on Indigenous research ethics and data sovereignty as well. Next slide. So again, bears repeating that sovereignty is a term simply defined as the right to self-govern. And at its core, sovereignty has notions rooted in the balance of power and decision-making. And as with any government, sovereign nations are responsible and accountable to its land and peoples. Sorry, next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we were going to talk about tribal nations today. And tribal nations are essentially a nation within a nation. So long before explorers were sent on behalf of their Western governments to seize resources in the name of progress for their community or for their countries, indigenous communities, especially in the United States, inhabited, cared for, and governed the land and its peoples. So the indigenous communities that these that were encountered had really complex and established systems of government, which included political, cultural, and economic governance. So this model that you see here comes out of the National Congress of American Indians, and as such kind of focuses on those in the United States and focuses on those in the United States. But this model does resonate because these nations are comprised of people, land, culture, and governance. And so when people think of the term Indigenous or American Indian, Alaska Native, or tribal, they often lump us all together without any regard to the rich history and diversity among Indigenous peoples, not only globally, but here in the United States. There are over 567 distinct tribal nations, and that includes those that are federally recognized, but there are also those that are state recognized and those that continue to be unrecognized by the government. However, there is just diversity across the entire United States. And so when you see us lumped together, make sure you think about that there's, layers upon layers behind that. But at its core, like I said, people, governance, culture, and land. Next slide, please. So when it comes to research, we have to think about sovereignty as well as intellectual property. And it's important to call this out because as a tribal nation, one of the core duties is protecting its cultural and intellectual property. And so really what this is just saying is that sovereign indigenous communities are ultimately accountable to their people and their land. And as I mentioned, this does kind of fall into research. And so when we think about tribal partnerships and working with specific tribes, we need to take into account and respect and honor their legal right to self-govern and provide input as to what they are willing and not willing to participate in when it comes to research projects. Next slide, please. So now I want to shift gears a little bit and think about as an individual citizen that's kind of embedded within their tribal sovereignty as well as other sovereigns. And so the reason I bring this up is that Indigenous peoples, we're not just a minority or just some sort of political group, but again, we're part of these many sovereigns that encompass our everyday life. And so again, this model comes out of NCAI. And, when I look at this and I see myself at the center of both federal, state, and tribal governments, I can have different interactions. So one example that sticks out to me as I looked at this was thinking about how I get healthcare and health insurance. So I could be on insurance through the marketplace, which is run by the state, right? Or I could choose to receive healthcare services from a tribal entity because of, my unique identity. And so back home, we have an Indian Health Service. And so I could choose to do that, which is more on the federal side of things because it's federally operated. And I'm going to do a deep dive into Indian Health Service in a couple slides. But this same example could apply to like registering your car, for example. Like I could choose to back home, get my car registered through the tribe, or I can get it registered through the state. And so as a citizen, there's this sort of fluidity in the types of services that we access and the level of participation we have in many of these branches of government. And so I just call that out because when we think about research projects in general, we have to remember too that citizens of tribes also have their own individual autonomy into what they participate in as well. Next slide, please. So this is going to be a very brief historical context around tribal nations, but I thought it was important to talk about the historical context because this history is really marred with periods of federal practice that was determined to terminate our sovereignty, assimilate people, and take land. And so over nearly a 100-year period, 370 treaties were signed by the federal government and sovereign tribal nations. And according to the US Constitution, these treaties are the supreme law of the land. However, many of these treaties that were negotiated were never ratified, and many of the treaties still have unfulfilled obligations, such as the underfunding of healthcare via the Indian Health Service. More pressing and even more concerning are those Indigenous communities that were never recognized by the federal government. Again, as I mentioned, I'm sitting here on unceded lands of the Duwamish tribe who are not recognized by the US government. And I think of those many other communities that are either not recognized or are state recognized, and I think that's a sort of heinous practice of the United States in determining who's ultimately considered Native or Indigenous here. Next slide, please. So today, however, a period beginning in 2000, they call it the nation to nation period. And so what this really means is that tribes are really leaning into their sovereignty and making gains in self-governance and independence. So there's a lot of really exciting things happening where we're reclaiming our land, our rights, our culture, and entering the workforce and revolutionizing the Western way of doing and being. And so, as I mentioned, this period began in 2000. So next slide. I was drafting these slides and I asked myself, are we in a new period? Right? Like this last period started in 2000. And so I'm like, that's been 20 years, and we've definitely seen a lot more growth in tribes, 638ing, which is the process of, at least taking control of their healthcare delivery systems. But I just sit back and have been reflecting a lot on my program, my PhD program that I'm in, which is the first of its kind in the whole world. And it's sort of the brainchild of, our ancestors' wisdom and the faculty at University of North Dakota who dreamt and put in the work to get this together. And so I have to ask myself and say, like, are we in an even better Renaissance period? Or like, I don't know what to exactly call it yet, but it just makes me thinking about, the next 20 years, right? And thinking about my peers in my class, my cohort that I'm in, and the work that we're going to do in our careers and how much that's going to continue to build capacity and elevate these conversations, and just curiously wondering what that period's going to be called. So just food for thought. But next slide. So thinking about tribal membership, it is an aspect of sovereignty, and it can really be a contentious conversation and honestly deserves its own presentation separately. This was not necessarily a scientific process by any means, but the first Indian census is what it's called, essentially gave rise to this concept of blood quantum, which means that when the government was in those periods of assimilation, they came in and were essentially asking us to provide pedigree as to the blood quantum of how much Indian we are. And so to give an example of this specifically, it's provided by each tribe's constitution. So for my tribe, for example, to be an enrolled member of the tribe, you have to be at least a quarter Turtle Mountain specifically. I'm 3/8, and so I do have a tribal ID that tells you what my blood quantum is. And so if I have any biological children, simple math says that my children will have 3/16 blood quantum Turtle Mountain. They would not be enrolled, but does that mean my kids are not Native? And this is a rhetorical question. I'm not asking anyone to answer this, but it does provide a really important conversation around tribal membership. And, again, putting it in with the context of research, you never ask someone for their tribal ID. The phrase self-identified is used because I don't find it appropriate for anyone to ask for my tribal ID. When I think about who's allowed to do that, I think of my tribe, and I think of, federal programs like Indian Health Service that ask for your tribal ID to prove that you fit into Indian preference for certain positions that are geared to promote more Native people entering into that particular workforce. But tribal membership is complex, and each tribe has a different view of membership. And I say requirements, but it's very Western in nature. But I think it's important to call out because, when we're thinking about recruitment, there are two aspects to consider, right? On the partnership side of things, you need to consider the tribes and tribal entities that you're working with and whether and what considerations you have there. But then when it comes to recruitment, you have to remember that citizens have some individual autonomy, but it's not the place of the research team to be asking folks for their enrollment cards, for example, which is just very specific sort of guideline that it would be like a best practice to just never do that. Next slide, please. Another piece of sort of a misconception, honestly, is that a lot of people think of American Indian Alaska Native populations and most immediately think of reservation-based or rural-based communities. However, that's not even what the data shows. In fact, there could be as much as 80% of all American Indian and Alaska Native people residing in urban settings. And this is due in part to, a couple different things. Some of it goes back to those assimilation and termination policies where individuals were forced to leave their homes and move into urban settings to assimilate to the general population. And for others, similar to my experience, is that I chose to move to Seattle, for example, for school. And so some of us, may be out here and continue to reside on other lands where we're guests because we, either got a job or went to a program. Nonetheless, whatever the reason, it has given rise to many urban Indian programs, which are an important component of our tribal healthcare delivery system as well, which you'll see in a couple slides. But it does create a very interesting urban Indian environment where there can be lots of us from many different tribes, meaning that programming has to consider that it might be serving a very diverse community of Native people who may be coming from all over the United States, maybe super connected to their tribe, maybe not so much. And so it really has a very interesting population to consider. Next slide, please. So moving briefly into tribal nation healthcare delivery, I'm sharing this image here because it's part of my teachings as far as how I understand health and how I understand a lot of things. Actually, there's a lot of pieces of the medicine wheel here that teach me a lot. But one thing I wanted to talk about when it comes to healthcare delivery in particular is this concept of, especially in research, we often ask the question like, how would you consider your health today? Which implies that we all have the same definition of health, which isn't necessarily true. I moved out to Washington about 5 years ago, and I remember sitting in my first master's program, one of my first classes in my master's program, and they were talking about Washington State integrating primary care and behavioral health. And it was like revolutionary, and it was this whole new thing, and it was, just this big moment, and they were still figuring out pieces, and they felt like it was such a good idea. It is a good idea. If you look at my medicine wheel, for example, when I think of health, that includes the physical, emotional, spiritual, and mental health. And so since I've been little, I've always thought of health as those 4 components. And so I think it's a very, simple and specific example, but I think it just goes to show that this was something that I've known since I was little, right? And so had I been at those tables where they're talking about how do we make some changes, just the sharing of that concept might have had this happen earlier, right? And so I think it's just a really strong example of traditional knowledge and Indigenous history and knowledge being, really sacred and honestly like a solution to many of the, like I said, our shared problems. And so what might seem as innovation actually just seems like they're just catching up. Next slide, please. So as part of those treaties that were signed over that 100-year period, one of the promises in some of these treaties was the fulfillment of health, or the promise of healthcare. It's important to call out that Indian Health Service is not an insurance program. It's not an insurance program. It's not something that there's like necessarily an application form. Once we verify identity, there's no premium payments. And frankly, there's no immediate recourse when services are inadequate to meet demand. It's operated out of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and typically only offers primary care and some limited dental services, and then does have some form of monies available via contract health services, purchase referred care that allow members to receive care that's not offered at IHS elsewhere. However, what's important to call out about this, insurance program or people thinking that we get free healthcare, IHS records actually show that it has declined to pay medical bills for more than 500,000 patients, which has saddled them with more than $2 billion in medical debt. So the real problem with Indian Health Service is that it is not fully funded as part of, these signed treaties. And so again, I think underscoring it is not an insurance program, and it is not just this free service. Like I just have to call that out for whoever's on this call, because it is something I still see in my work and in my experience today, that there's this concept of us getting free healthcare. Next slide, please. The Indian Health Service itself operates under an ITU system of care. So the I represents an Indian Health Service unit that is directly operated by the federal government. And so that's typically where things start. And then the T represents Tribal 638. So public law, 93-638. I hope I didn't get that wrong. I just had policy class, so if anybody's on there, they can correct me. But that represents when the tribe wants to exert its sovereignty and use those funds allocated for that facility and operate it itself. And then as we talked about, the U represents those urban Indian health programs that have come up with this movement towards the majority of American Indians and Alaska Natives living in urban communities. And so again, this is sort of just like a very high, quick level overview of IHS. Again, it could be its own longer presentation that can get specifically into the laws and considerations and eligibility and all of those things. But what I really just wanted to call out is that the system, has the federally operated side, the tribally operated side, and the urban side. Next slide. So I'm shifting gears one more time into just a conversation around research ethics, as well as data sharing issues, just to kind of give some high-level highlights to it. Next slide. So Indigenous research history. I've had many conversations throughout my program, as well as working in this institution, about Indigenous research history, but it's always worth reiterating that Indigenous peoples have always been scientists and healers, asking questions and understanding the world in ways that the Western world is just catching up to. Again, we have solutions to more than just things for our communities, but also those who are willing to work, partner, and lift up Native voice and traditional knowledge as well. And so, much of the research that has been done has really failed to take in community voice and knowledge because it's not evidence, and I have quotes literally in my slide notes as well, or included Indigenous communities in decision-making. And so it's really Western-based research that's conducted in communities or on communities, not with us. So there's that term helicopter research, where researchers fly in, they get what they want, they leave, right? They get their throwaway paper that they can say that they did. So they get, not the brownie points, but that meet whatever their requirements are for performance reviews and stuff. And too often those research papers that come through, or how they're published, they just really poorly represent Indigenous communities and frankly just promote that false narrative that we've been talking about today. Next slide. So because of this, we see a growing body of work in Indigenous methodologies. And by growing body of work, I mean kind of formally put into the academy, because as I mentioned, Native people with traditional knowledge have been doing this for centuries, and many of us carry that knowledge in our communities. And just because it's in community doesn't mean that this body of work is coming out of nowhere, right? We're just choosing to, publish it and put it in places for other Native researchers and other scholars, and that's a choice and an exertion of sovereignty of community as well. But it's that growing body of literature that's kind of challenging this idea of what evidence actually is. And so moving towards incorporating traditional knowledge and, historical practice of Indigenous communities, we're really moving from this idea of like best practice into sort of a wise practice, right? And then also, evidence informed versus evidence based. So some of that language is really powerful, because for too long, it's really taken power away from Native communities who, like I said, have been caring for the land, for example. I know with all these forest fires, I know in California, they were just talking about going back to sort of the old ways, right? And doing things that the Native people that cared for those lands previously did to combat the constant fires that we have here out west. But it's really important to colonizing practice. It's letting us as Indigenous researchers and our allies, it's letting us recapture that power and provide healing to community. And we're not asking for a seat at the table. Frankly, we're demanding it. And, it's like we're going to do it with or without you. So it's kind of like get on the ship or stay home. Next slide, please. So merging those two things, we also see this idea about Indigenous data sovereignty. And so there's a movement of exerting that sovereignty in this important arena, right? So to do any sort of strategic planning or to solve any problem, frankly, you need relevant and reliable data. And that's especially true for Indigenous communities. With this sort of new capacity building work comes an increased focus on not only generating that data, but analyzing the data in-house, right? And so as we mentioned, data is that collection of stories, putting our experience on paper and in conversation in places where we can take it and use it and make something better for a community. And really this work just ultimately creates that, more evidence, as I said, increases our internal capacities and increases our ability to create programming that's driven by community knowledge and specific to community, because again, it's community driven. Next slide, please. So on Indigenous data sovereignty, you see this sort of continuum, right? So data dependency means that, you don't have as much internal capacity to generate or analyze your data, which, give rise to different kinds of partnerships. But specifically moving from data dependency to data sovereignty involves both control and use. And so the key element of governance talks about driving the research and deciding who to work with, whether it be internal or external partners, or whether that's Indigenous or non-Indigenous peoples that you want to work with. But that governance is really key and is solely embedded in that tribal nation framework, right? So exerting your sovereignty for control, which is a powerful movement of decolonization. And so to decolonize, we get into conversations around incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing and being while creating new methods to conduct Indigenous research. And so that's really important work to make sure that we're including community voice and lifting up Native voices and not promoting helicopter research, right? So again, demanding that seat at the table and building capacity as tribal nations and frankly, tribal organizations and communities as well. And so next slide. This has sort of manifested itself in a couple different ways. So one thing that's been given rise is these tribal institutional review boards. And so this is one way of creating capacity to help control that new health research that comes through, as well as setting research topics and ideas that are specific to community. And it really achieves that mission of controlling data and sort of the who has access to it and who's participating in it. According to the Indian Health Service website, there are 15 independent tribal IRBs, as well as 10 IHS IRBs, including one national IRB, which is a reminder that some communities may utilize a different process or not have that research capacity of others, meaning they may have, I've seen a couple examples of, kind of sub-councils. So they have the tribal council and maybe like a health policy, or not health policy, but like a health council. So their approval mechanisms might look slightly different and might not look as formal as a tribal IRB, which sort of mirrors what you'd see in like an academic institution working with an IRB. So just a reminder that, if you've seen one, you've seen one. Next slide, please. Another component of Indian Health Service that contributes to this data sovereignty conversation are tribal epidemiology centers. And they really help with that data and analysis piece. And there are tribal epidemiology centers, which are funded by both Indian Health Service and CDC. The Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare law, contained provisions to have tribal epidemiology centers be designated public health authorities, which gave them access to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Service data, which included Indian Health Service data, which many tribal administrators working in federally operated service units recognize that data is such a challenge to get from Indian Health Service, and that's largely because of sort of an antiquated electronic health record system and sort of so it's really difficult to get data. So I've had conversations around how do you strategic plan when you have no access to data. This is sort of one piece of the solution. So each of the 12 tribal epidemiology centers share a similar mission in improving the health of American Indian and Alaska Natives by identifying and understanding health risks and inequities, strengthening public health capacity, and assisting in disease prevention and control. However, they each offer a unique array of services and activities to their constituents. And so they're really responsive to their regions. As you see here in the different colors, they each serve a different region. Next slide, please. So even beyond just approving data, some tribal IRBs have kind of morphed and turned into a larger unit. So this is back home in Turtle Mountain, where I'm from. And this is the Tribal Nations Research Group, and they're generating data, analyzing it, and disseminating it for their communities. They're really engaging tribal members and stakeholders in the development of community assessments and data collection activities. They're providing quality research education materials designed to educate the community about research and the research process, and provide educational services to the community. I personally think it's really cool that they're really focused on sort of, it's not necessarily demystifying the research process itself, but I think one really important piece of, I think, my career and those working alongside me, along my peers, is that we're actually going to see in the next 20 years a lot of work around reclaiming our power around research as Indigenous communities, because we're building capacity. So we have, Indigenous researchers, data analysts, everyone that's going to be part of the process. And I think what we're going to see is, research won't become this big thing that nobody necessarily understands. Like, we're going to parson it out and make it Indigenous research methods and really bring community into that process. And so that's something I really like to see back home, at least while I'm out here in Seattle. But what they are essentially doing is promoting data use, and data sovereignty through strategic planning, as well as supporting public and private economic development and opportunity, and most importantly, upholding positive images of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians, which I think is really powerful, that we have an approval mechanism that's really focused on that for community. Next slide, please. And so the last piece of the framework, those three core things before we get into our call to action, is visibility. And so bringing us back to the present, next slide, which I think is a really perfect opportunity to talk about the census. And so I'll talk about Indian country in 2010, so the previous census, just because I had these slides, and I think it's cool to see that census compared to this one. And I kept these two pictures in here. It comes out of a report out of National Congress of American Indians. So the percentages might be different this upcoming census, but they didn't quite have these images ready yet. But there are 229 tribes located in Alaska and 338 tribes located in 34 other states, for a total of 567 sovereign tribal nations that have federal recognition. American Indian trust land areas comprise 56 million acres, and Alaska Native corporations and villages control 44 million acres as fee simple land under the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. American Indian and Alaska Native trust land encompasses 100 million acres, which would make it the fourth largest state in the United States. The Navajo Nation alone would be the 42nd largest, which would be larger than many East Coast states like Maryland, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts. In 2020, the top states with a high percentage of American Indian or Alaska Natives were Alaska at 14.8%, New Mexico at 8.9%, South Dakota at 8.4%, Montana at 6%, and North Dakota at 4.8%, which is slightly different than what we see on this slide. Next slide, please. So Indian country today, on the 2020 census, it is an extremely fast growing population. As of the 2020 census, 9.7 million people in the United States identified as American Indian or Alaska Native, which is an 86.5 increase since 2010. This has major implications for voting, programming, and especially in states with high percentage of American Indian and Alaska Native people. Of that 9.7 million, about 3.7 million self-identified as American Indian and Alaska Native alone, with the majority, about 5.9 million, in combination of one race or more, which I think underscores the rich diversity among Native people living in the United States. Over 3 million are of voting age, and Indian country is very young. The median age is about 26 for those on reservations, compared to 37 for the rest of the United States. And some states have even higher proportions of young Native people, such as in South Dakota, where the rate is approximately 40% under 18 years old, which equates to about 75,000 Native youth. So our youth are our future, and we're only just getting started. Next slide, please. So one other piece I just wanted to call out as far as the Indian Health Service kind of landscape here in Washington State, where I'm from. Back home in North Dakota, we are predominantly direct service units run by the federal government. But here in Washington State, we kind of see the opposite. And so in Washington State, you see a lot more tribes exerting their sovereignty and tribally operating their facilities. You do see 2 urban programs. So the 2 green, I guess you'd call them like medical symbols, one in Seattle and one in Spokane. And then just a couple Indian Health Service facilities that are run by the federal government. But I just like showing this graphic to partners, especially in Washington State, because I've seen some really cool things at a couple of these clinics. I've seen the merging of both kind of best/wise practices from Western culture as well as Indian country. So I've seen community get together and help design a clinic that incorporates, their knowledge and their creation story, respects their elders. And then also I've seen, really efficient systems that kind of come out of the Western way of doing things, like the Kanban system and the lean principles and stuff. And so I just think it's really cool because it's just a feat that's only possible because of the tribe's inherent, right to sovereignty. And so you see that they can pick the best of both worlds and create the best thing for community. And it's just a really resounding example of what is possible in our lifetimes when we sit down, have conversation, learn our history, and connect with one another. Next slide, please. So again, I sort of think we're in this revitalization period, or I'm still coming up with whatever the word's going to be for this period, and then I'll submit it to NCAI and see if they'll accept it. But it is really being directed by Native peoples. We're leaders and pioneers in our fields. Our communities are being led by citizens of hundreds of sovereign tribal nations, and we carry cultural wisdom and professional expertise into every sector of society, both in our tribal communities and in our non-Native institutions that we may work in. Reclaiming our land use, our historical practices, our language, breaking cycles of dependence, moving along that spectrum from data dependency to data sovereignty, and then going on personal journeys. Like for me, I recognize that I grew up in a very, Catholic heavy community. And so I'm reconnecting with my culture and my language as much as I can, working full time and going to school. But it's a beautiful process, and it's really exciting knowing that I have peers and colleagues and even youth that are excited about this work, and I'm excited to see what this period might look like. Next slide, please. So we have our final piece of the framework, which is call to action. Next slide. So this is a slide I give folks at the end. So one piece of work that I encourage community partners, especially new ones, to look at is that Reclaiming Native Truthwork that I mentioned that developed this framework anticipated this work being perpetuated via kind of a snowball method where everyone goes out and shares it. And one piece of their work that came out is a guide for allies and partners. And so I usually have them read that and then, let them do their homework and talk about how we can advance this new narrative. So, playing a supporting role in having more than just me come and talk to you, right? Like I mentioned, I'm one person, probably going to make mistakes. There's only so many things that I know from my experiences, and that we're all better off listening to more Native people, working with more communities, and making room for those conversations. Going beyond words and actually letting your actions speak for themselves, digesting materials. Too often I find myself, fielding questions where I'm like, a simple Google search goes a long way. It really does. You can do your homework. You can, and if you come and say, hey, I tried to figure this out, it's confusing to me, because there are many things that I still find confusing, like insurance, for example. We were just in the office, and insurance is really hard to figure out. So understanding insurance plus understanding the Indian Health Service, that's a very difficult thing. And so that kind of stuff makes sense to me. But there are simple questions that I think people can do their homework and then ask for help. So beyond that, I recommend that guide to people if you need access to it and you can't find it. I'm happy to pass it along, or you can reach out. My email is going to be at the end of this slide. Next slide, please. So final recommendations, because I know it's 11:53 already, and I want to give some time for a few Q&A questions. Keep promoting tribally affiliated IRBs and building capacity to drive that sort of research, dissemination and practice. Continue educating about data sharing agreements, especially as they relate to tribal sovereignty. So whether you're wanting to work with a tribe specifically or a tribal organization, educating about quality and ethical research. So expanding on the conversations we had today, and ultimately just being an advocate, continuing to do that work. I find that really approaching this with a very anti-racist framework. We've been doing a lot of that work is really helpful, because you're allowing yourself to recognize that, listen, I'm going to probably have some implicit bias. I just don't know how deep that damage is embedded into me, but I'm willing to do the work. And that includes me, right? I don't get some free pass just because I'm a Native person, right? I still have to do this and ask myself really challenging questions to unlearn certain pieces of my identity as well that may be problematic. So I just continue to encourage collaboration, partnership, conversation, and I will just end with another, it's great to be Indigenous. It's a beautiful month, and I'm just happy to have done this. So I apologize for going super late, but any questions?
I can start us off with a question. Oops, sorry, was there someone else?
Oh, yeah. So thanks so much for that excellent and insightful presentation, Cole. We really appreciate it. There were a few questions that were posted in the chat box, and it looks like Tiffany is raising her hand. So while I get those questions going, Tiffany, did you want to ask a question either in the Q&A or? Okay.
Is she able to unmute? Because I can see some questions here.
Tiffany, can you hear? Can you talk?
Hello?
Hello.
Oh, yeah, we hear her. Hi,
Oh,
Tiffany.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to say Uju and Chimigwich for such a wonderful talk. It's long overdue and well delivered. You did a great job, and thank you for that. That's all.
Oh, thank you, Miigwech. It's good to hear your voice. It's been a while since we've met in person.
I know. I don't have my camera on. I'm not sure why, but it's probably just as well. I probably have food on my face from the last meeting. Anyway, your work is great. So I'm glad you're teaching people about all of this stuff, because preserving and protecting these relationships is critical, just to respect, you know, the people that we're engaging with and working with, trying to work with, to do the work that is ahead, the work of now and the work that is ahead. So without those respectful relationships, things don't go forward in that good way, in that medicine way, you know. So I don't need to tell you, because you're the one teaching the session. So thank you.
Teaching, whoever would have said I would be a teacher.
You are a teacher. You're a great teacher, Cole.
I
I like
appreciate
that.
it.
Tell Albert I said hello if you ever see him.
I will. When I'm home for Christmas, I'll tell him you said hi.
Thanks.
If folks have to jump off at 12, that's fine. I'm looking through a couple of conversations in the chat. Yeah, I agree. I mean, having a separate conversation about why tribes aren't recognized, not federally recognized, I think is a bigger conversation, but I'm looking through some of the answers. But yeah, you know, acts of Congress, executive orders, you know, it kind of depends on the tribe that isn't federally recognized, as to why it has or has not happened. Yeah, Tiffany's talking about blood quantum not being accurate. So that's why I said it was not a scientific process. I think somebody walked around with a piece of paper and said, you know, how much native are you? So that's another piece too, when it does make a difference when you start doing the math. Like, they think my family's wrong, so my kids should be enrolled because they think at least we're about half. So that would make my kids enrolled, which does make a difference when it comes to accessing certain programs and things. And so it does make a difference. And it's also, just like I said, inherently a terrible process, because the only other thing that's pedigreed is dogs, you know, when you think about it. Sorry.
Well,
Go ahead.
with the tribal communities federally recognized, their question that was posed, are there tribes or tribal communities that want to be federally recognized that you're aware of?
I know there's a couple in Washington State. I haven't looked too deeply into them, because I think you sort of figure that stuff out, or you hear about it once you move to those areas and you figure out what communities are actively still in that process. I think so. Chief Little Shell tribe in Montana, which is a tribe related to mine, just got their federal recognition recently in the last year or so. So you still see that process. I mean, there are tribes still trying to receive federal recognition.
Yeah, there's another question, Cole, about the data sovereignty. So how do institutions and others overseeing grants and research acknowledge the data dependency versus data sovereignty idea? And then as a follow-up, are there institutions like the NIH that respond to this way, data sovereignty to data collecting and management, that you're aware of?
Yeah, I mean, you see it like WSU's IRB, for example, has experience and is sort of not necessarily formally refined their process to have sort of, I don't know if administrative callouts, but like at least consideration for any projects that have participation from tribes or tribal entities, or even tribal people. They make sure that application is reviewed So it usually, defers to the fact that and lifts up tribal sovereignty. So they respect that the tribe has ultimate say. And so having an institution understand that is important, because describing that whole process, I mean, it'd be basically like giving this presentation, but like for a longer period of time, because I essentially would have to teach a tribal IRB tribal sovereignty and why they have to go through this process to make sure that, their IRB is like here and the tribal sovereignty is here. So if the tribe says no, the tribe says no. If the tribe doesn't want to do biospecimens, they don't do biospecimens, like period. So that's just, my experience at WSU, but I've also seen other tribal IRB applications where I'm like, where in this does it ever indicate like we need to look at this with a thorough eye, or you can't just have some volunteer come in and look at this tribal IRB or this IRB focused on Native communities. So how does it, essentially provide that protection or understanding?
Great, thanks so much. We also had a question about slide 47, the urban and rural counties, Washington State. What does the red symbol mean in Jefferson County?
Oh, so that means they don't have a facility itself. And so the funding that would be provided to that facility is usually kind of put into what they call purchase and referred care. And so they have to sort of outsource their healthcare. I don't know the formal mechanism in which they do that. I've heard and seen some tribes pay for insurance out of pocket. So like their community doesn't actually pay the premiums, the tribe covers it, but then the tribal member has access to insurance and can go, to the neighbor community or whatnot.
Great, thanks so much. So we are trying to recognize time here. Thanks so much for everyone for sticking on. We're going to close out, but Cole, if you're available to stay on and answer any other questions folks have, we can go ahead and do that. So thanks again for attending this webinar today, everybody. Please remember to complete the post-webinar evaluation survey, which is really helpful for us in creating our webinars. Typically, we host at least a few webinars each year, so keep your eye out, and we hope to see you again in the future. Thanks so much. We hope